I never thought the woman who raised me would one day look me dead in the eye and say, "You're no longer needed here. Clear out your desk." My name is Emily Hayes. I'm 31 years old, and up until 2 weeks ago, I was the operations director of my family's bakery business, Hayes and Hearth, a beloved local chain my grandfather built from the ground up. I'd spent the last 6 years pouring every ounce of myself into that company. Early mornings, late nights, holidays skipped, all because I believed in the dream Grandpa passed down to us. I always assumed my mother, Linda Hayes, would eventually pass the torch to me when she was ready to retire. It wasn't entitlement. I earned that role. I knew every supplier by name, every employee's birthday, every inch of our flagship store. But instead of being rewarded for my loyalty, I was blindsided. It happened on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day where the clouds felt too heavy to be real. I walked into the office like usual, juggling a tray of espresso shots for the staff and invoices under my arm. That's when I saw the envelope on my desk. My name, handwritten in my mother's cursive. Inside? A letter. Cold. Formal. Termination of employment, effective immediately. I stood there stunned, barely able to breathe. A minute later, she walked in, perfectly calm in her tailored navy suit. No emotion. Just business. She said, "This is what's best for the company. Your priorities are no longer aligned with our vision." I replied, my voice shaking, "What vision, Mom?" "The one where you sell out Grandpa's legacy to that corporate franchise?" She didn't answer. Just turned and walked away. I should have walked too. But instead, I stayed frozen, hands gripping the letter. I wasn't just fired, I was erased. No goodbye from the staff. No explanation to the board. No warning. Later that night, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving for a celebration that would never come. I pulled out the worn leather journal Grandpa left me, his private business diary, filled with notes, thoughts, and something else I hadn't paid much attention to before, a series of entries about my mother. About what she did years ago, what she tried to hide, and what Grandpa warned me might come to light one day. I never wanted revenge. But now? Now, I had no choice. This Sunday, there's a family meeting. My mom thinks it's just another check-in about quarterly performance and new marketing strategies. But this time I'm bringing Grandpa's journal with me. And a few other things she never expected me to find. You don't just fire your daughter like she's disposable. Not when she knows your darkest secret. After I found Grandpa's journal that night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up reading, page after page, each entry hitting harder than the last. The ink was faded in some spots, water-stained in others. I wasn't sure if the smudges were from his hands or mine. The entries weren't written to anyone in particular, but they told a clear story. A story of someone who loved this family more than anything, who built a business not for wealth or status, but to give us something real, something rooted. And someone who had seen the rot growing inside his own daughter. It wasn't bitterness. Grandpa never sounded bitter. He was disappointed, yes. Confused, often. But more than anything, he was heartbroken. The kind of heartbreak that builds slowly over decades until it quietly breaks you. He wrote about the early days, how excited my mother had been when she first joined the business in her 20s. How she brought energy and ideas, helped modernize the storefronts, convinced him to hire a branding consultant. For a while, he thought she was the future. He called her my brightest light in one entry. But then, somewhere along the way, the light shifted. By the time I was 10, I could already sense it, though I didn't have the words back then. My mom had become obsessed with image. With growth for growth's sake. She started treating the bakery less like a family business and more like a corporate entity, and that change was slow but relentless. She stopped coming in early to knead dough or greet regulars by name. She spent her time in meetings with consultants and marketing reps, hosting wine and cheese networking nights instead of recipe testing. Grandpa kept writing, kept documenting the change. Linda wants to franchise. I said no. She said I'm afraid of success. She brought in a potential buyer today. Says the offer is too good to refuse. I told her Hayes and Hearth isn't for sale. She didn't speak to me for 3 days. If Emily chooses to join the business one day, I'll know it's in safe hands. Reading that line felt like a hand reaching out across time. Grandpa had seen something in me even when I was a child, helping him count the days till on a Saturday afternoon while powdered sugar clung to my sleeves. Back then, he used to call me his little ledger. I thought it was silly at the time, but I know now he meant it with love. I kept track of things. I noticed the details. I cared. When I was 14, I started working in the main store every summer. I was sweeping floors and wiping down tables at first, but Grandpa made sure I learned every part of the process. Baking. Inventory. Payroll. Vendor negotiations. And not from behind a desk. From the floor, from the oven, from the delivery truck. He said the only way to lead was to understand the people you were leading. Not just their roles, but their rhythms. I'd come home some days so exhausted I'd collapse onto my bed without changing clothes. My mother would scoff at me from the hallway, making remarks about how I didn't need to prove anything. That I should be enjoying my youth, going out more, dating. Not burying myself in spreadsheets and baking schedules. But she never once offered to help when things got busy. Never rolled up her sleeves to pitch in when the staff was short. She said that's what managers were for. Over time, it became clear to everyone who was really running the place. My grandfather may have been the name on the door, but as he aged, it was my hands on the wheel. Quietly. Respectfully. I never challenged him publicly, never tried to push him out. I honored his decisions, even when I disagreed. And when he passed, I thought we would carry forward everything he taught us. As a family. That was the fantasy. The reality was my mother had been waiting. Waiting for the silence. Waiting for the space to finally reshape the business, and the family, in her own image. And I, loyal and blind, never saw it coming. What I didn't understand until now was just how long she had been preparing for that moment. The journal revealed things I'd never been told. Loans she had secretly taken out in the business's name and paid off without anyone knowing. Small decisions that looked benign on the surface, but all designed to remove Grandpa's control bit by bit. Vendors who had been quietly replaced with her friends' companies. Bonuses shifted away from long-term employees to new hires she could influence. It wasn't just betrayal. It was strategic. Cold. And through it all, I kept showing up, kept trying to bring warmth and stability to a place that was slowly being hollowed out behind the scenes. Now I understand why she fired me. Because I was the only one who remembered what Hayes and Hearth was supposed to be. I was the only threat left. I couldn't stop thinking about how different we were, my mother and I. And how that difference wasn't just generational, it was foundational. She viewed legacy as leverage. I viewed it as stewardship. She believed in scaling up. I believed in deepening roots. She saw the business as a brand. I saw it as a living thing. Even when I tried to confront her over the years, it never led anywhere. She was an expert at deflection, at turning questions into insults. Whenever I asked about the old recipes she'd removed from the menu, the longtime employees she'd phased out, the subtle but important changes, she'd wave me off. "You're too sentimental, Emily," she'd say. "That's not how things work anymore." But that was the point. It wasn't supposed to work that way. Not in our family. Not with Grandpa's name still hanging above the entrance. And now, she had taken everything I'd built with her, and discarded me like I was some part-time seasonal hire. Someone who didn't belong. The deeper I dug into the journal, the more I found. Grandpa had left notes for me, hidden between tax summaries and staffing memos. Questions he had about inventory shortages. Payroll inconsistencies. Vendor conflicts of interest. Things he never accused her of outright, but documented carefully. Like a man who knew someday someone would need to know the truth. And he trusted that someone to be me. By dawn, I had a legal pad filled with notes and 3 manila folders stacked with printed copies of internal emails, invoices, and receipts I'd quietly collected over the years but never fully reviewed. That morning, as sunlight hit the corner of my bedroom, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to the family meeting empty-handed. I wasn't going to beg for my job or explain myself. I was going to show them, her, exactly who I am. And who Grandpa always knew I would become. The family meeting was scheduled for Sunday afternoon at the Hayes family estate, the same house I'd grown up in. A place where the walls held more silence than comfort. I hadn't set foot inside since Grandpa's funeral, not because of grief, but because every visit since his passing had felt like walking into a room where my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. I knew I'd be walking into a coordinated ambush. My mother never did anything without an audience. And that's what this was, a performance. A calculated display designed to strip away my credibility and reframe me as the unstable, emotional daughter who couldn't handle professional responsibility. The days leading up to it were quiet. Too quiet. I received no phone calls. No emails. No formal documents regarding my termination, just that single, cold letter and my revoked access to the company systems. My work email had been deactivated. My company keycard no longer worked. HR hadn't reached out. And the board? Silent as stone. It was a strategy. Isolation disguised as procedure. What made it worse was that no one else from the family reached out either. Not my younger cousin June, who I'd mentored through her first business course. Not my Uncle Greg, who used to call me Little CEO during Christmas brunches. Not even Kayla, my own sister, who lived just 2 neighborhoods away. That silence cut deeper than the firing itself. In their eyes, if my mother was right, then I was irrelevant. Disposable. The night before the meeting, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the folders on my kitchen table. Pages of documentation, vendor agreements, financial reports, copied emails, and Grandpa's handwritten journal entries, all organized and tabbed. But what I couldn't prepare for was the emotional erosion that crept in. I kept thinking back to the night I signed my first management contract. I was 27, finally stepping into a formal leadership role after years of operating in the shadows of others. My mother had barely acknowledged the milestone, choosing instead to critique my outfit during the celebration dinner. "You should have worn something sharper," she had said as we left the restaurant. That was her way, approval always just out of reach, dangled like a prize I'd never quite earned. Back then, I still believed that if I worked hard enough, she would see me. Not just as a capable professional, but as a daughter worthy of respect. I see now that respect was never something she intended to give me. Because respect, for her, was currency. A reward you granted only if it served your purpose. That realization hurt more than I care to admit. What I hadn't expected was the text from Adam. We hadn't spoken in almost 2 months. Not since he'd taken the position in Denver, and we agreed, amicably, to put distance between us and see where life took us. The message was simple. Heard what happened. If you need someone in your corner, I'm here. I stared at it for a long time before replying. Adam had been more than a boyfriend, he was my sounding board, my mirror. A quiet force in my life who always reminded me that integrity wasn't just something I inherited from Grandpa, but something I lived by every day. When we finally spoke that night, it wasn't dramatic. It was grounding. He didn't ask what I planned to do. He didn't offer advice I hadn't asked for. He simply reminded me who I was. That reminder mattered. Because the pressure the next day was relentless. From the moment I stepped onto the estate's circular driveway, I could feel it. The gathering wasn't just a meeting, it was a setup. The sleek black car parked out front with government plates told me there were attorneys inside. Not advisors. Not neutral parties. Hired weapons. Inside the living room, the furniture had been rearranged to mimic a boardroom. A large table, legal pads, glasses of lemon water. My mother stood at the head of the room, her posture tight and controlled. On either side of her were her new allies, Davis and Rowe, a corporate law firm known for aggressive takeovers. To her left, Kayla sat with her arms crossed. She didn't look at me. To the right, my Uncle Greg and Aunt Marion, both uncharacteristically silent. As I took my seat, no one offered greetings. The air was thick with rehearsed indifference. The meeting began with my mother reading a prepared statement, outlining leadership restructuring and strategic realignment. The words were cold, clinical, designed to strip emotion from what was, at its heart, a family betrayal. When she finished, she handed me a slim folder. Inside, an offer. Severance. Confidentiality clauses. A release of all claims. It was insulting. The amount? Barely half of my annual salary. Conditional upon my silence. I didn't respond. I didn't even blink. They took my lack of reaction as weakness. My mother leaned in, her voice softer now, almost sympathetic. She said, "This isn't personal, Emily. It's business. We want to help you move on." That's when it began. The guilt. The emotional pressure. Greg spoke next, his tone hesitant, his words chosen carefully. He reminisced about Grandpa and how proud he'd be of the company's growth. He said things change. That businesses evolve. That roles sometimes need to shift. Marion followed, praising my dedication, but gently reminding me that sometimes stepping aside is the most mature thing a person can do. Then came Kayla. Her words cut the deepest. She talked about how I'd become overly attached to the business. How my intensity made people uncomfortable. How she worried I was losing perspective. That maybe this was for my own good. Each word was crafted to sound concerned. But they were laced with poison. Gaslighting. Manipulation. Emotional blackmail. They wanted me to believe I was the problem. That I'd become unstable. That my removal was a kindness. But the worst part wasn't what they said. It was how normal it all sounded. Polite. Professional. Disguised in the language of love and care. That's what made it so effective. That's what made me question myself, even as I knew the truth. I sat there for nearly 2 hours as they dismantled my role in the business, painted me as a liability, and repackaged their betrayal as mercy. And still, I said nothing. Because I wasn't ready yet. Because I wasn't going to waste my words in a room designed to silence me. I left that meeting with their offer in my bag and their voices echoing in my head. By the time I got back to my apartment, I felt like I'd been hollowed out. I stood in my living room, the folder still untouched on my table, and wondered, briefly, if it would be easier to just let it all go. To walk away. Start over. But then I saw the note taped to my fridge. Grandpa's handwriting from a birthday card years ago. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you protect while you're here. I stared at those words for a long time. And the weight in my chest slowly shifted. I wasn't going to let them rewrite history. I wasn't going to let them erase me. And I wasn't going to let her, the woman who fired me from my own future, walk away clean. Because I had something they didn't. I had the truth. And I was ready to use it. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in weeks. No more hesitation. No more hoping they'd come to their senses. They had shown me exactly who they were, and I was done giving them the benefit of the doubt. I wasn't after revenge. I wasn't trying to burn it all down. But I wasn't going to let them rewrite Grandpa's legacy. Not without a fight. So I did what he would have done. I started documenting everything. First, I pulled out my personal laptop and external hard drives, years of work files, meeting notes, and backups I'd kept without thinking. Every board presentation I'd built. Every quarterly report I'd drafted. Every memo I'd sent that mysteriously never made it into the official records. I opened them one by one, searching for patterns. There were discrepancies. Gaps in vendor contracts that didn't match the invoices. An old supplier who'd stopped working with us abruptly, despite a multi-year agreement still in effect at the time. Financial records from a marketing campaign that had exceeded its approved budget by nearly 40%, with no formal explanation. I remembered that campaign. It was around the time Mom brought in her old college friend, Denise, as a branding consultant. Denise had been hired without a formal interview, and her firm had been paid through a private account, not the usual expense pipeline. I dug deeper into the emails. Sure enough, the invoices were padded. Line items like strategic market alignment and ambassador outreach strategy that didn't mean anything, and certainly didn't yield measurable results. I created a master spreadsheet, dates, amounts, names, and cross-references. As the hours passed, the picture became clearer. My mother had been quietly diverting company funds to personal contacts and backdoor deals for at least 2 years. Some legal. Most not. All unethical. I knew this alone wouldn't be enough. Accusations needed evidence. So I went further. I pulled copies of archived security footage from the main office, backups I'd made routinely during my time as operations director, just in case. One clip stood out. A closed-door meeting between my mother, Greg, and one of the Davis and Rowe attorneys, timestamped 2 weeks before Grandpa's death. On the footage, I couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was tense, and there was paperwork being exchanged. That footage wasn't just suspicious, it could establish a timeline. Then I remembered something even more crucial: the voicemail archive. During my tenure, I'd implemented a system to store voicemails digitally as part of our business continuity protocol. I logged into the server. It was still active. I filtered the messages by sender and date. Hundreds of voicemails. I nearly gave up after 2 hours of listening to dry supplier updates and HR inquiries. Then I found one. It was from Grandpa. Dated just 3 days before his heart attack. His voice was weaker than I remembered, raspy, but unmistakably clear. He said, "Emily, if you get this, I need you to check the invoices from the White Pine contract. Something's not adding up. Your mother's not listening to me anymore. I think she's moving forward with a deal I never signed off on. Please be careful. And, trust your instincts. I love you, kiddo." I paused the message and sat in silence. It was the confirmation I didn't know I needed. He had seen it too. He had tried to warn me. I saved the file, backed it up to multiple drives, and uploaded it to a secure cloud folder with password protection. Then I started printing everything: paper copies of all financials, highlighted and annotated. Contracts. Memos. Emails. Grandpa's journal entries. The voicemail transcript. 3 binders by the end of the night, each color-coded and indexed. I wasn't done. I reached out to one of my former contacts at a compliance firm we'd worked with in the past. A quiet professional named Samuel Yates, retired, discreet, and fiercely loyal to Grandpa. He'd once told me during a lunch meeting that Harold Hayes was the last man in business he truly respected. I didn't go into detail in my message. I simply asked if he'd be willing to review a few internal documents for potential irregularities. Within 24 hours, he replied with one sentence. "Send them over, and I'll take a look." For Harold. That night, I met with Adam again, this time in person. He flew in from Denver for one night only. We didn't talk much about us. That wasn't the priority. Instead, he offered what I needed most: perspective. I showed him the binders, the charts, the evidence. He listened. He asked questions. And when I was done, he looked at me, not like I was overreacting or caught in emotion, but like I was someone who had been through hell and stood up anyway. He said, "You're ready." I nodded. Because I was. What I didn't tell him, what I hadn't told anyone, was that I'd also been speaking with an estate attorney. Quietly. Carefully. Grandpa's will had already been executed. But his final business directives had a supplemental clause: one that allowed the operations director to submit a formal petition to halt any major restructuring within 12 months of his passing if they believed it violated his legacy terms. It was a clause no one ever expected to be used. A relic, hidden in legal language. But I'd found it. And I was still, legally, the operations director when Mom signed the initial restructuring contracts. If I could prove that her actions violated those directives, the court could issue an injunction. Not just to stop the sale, but to trigger a review of company leadership. It was a long shot. But it was real. I included that clause in the final binder, highlighted in yellow. By the time I zipped the folders into my case, I wasn't nervous. I was calm. The kind of calm that comes when there's nothing left to lose. The kind of calm Grandpa always had when he walked into a negotiation, because he knew his numbers, knew his ethics, and knew his worth. I wasn't afraid of the confrontation anymore. Because this time it wasn't about defending myself. It was about honoring him. And making sure the truth spoke louder than the lies. The following Saturday arrived gray and overcast, the kind of day where the light never fully breaks through and everything feels like it's holding its breath. I wore black, not to be dramatic, but because it grounded me. Professional, sharp, deliberate. Not mourning. Not grieving. Focused. I packed my 3 binders into a slim leather case and tucked the flash drive into a hidden compartment in my wallet. Samuel Yates had confirmed my findings and written a statement of review. I printed it on thick paper, the weight of it oddly comforting in my hands. The meeting was to be held in the private conference room on the 2nd floor of Hayes and Hearth's flagship store, the same room where, years ago, Grandpa had gathered the family to celebrate his retirement announcement. I remember him smiling that day, hopeful, even as age lined his eyes. Now, the room felt different. The warmth was gone. The air inside buzzed with tension. Everyone was already there when I arrived. My mother sat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by the same 2 attorneys from Davis and Rowe. Kayla was to her right, arms crossed and jaw tight. Uncle Greg and Aunt Marion sat near the window, whispering between themselves. A few members of the board were present as well, non-voting relatives and distant cousins who'd long since aligned with whatever direction kept them comfortable. No one stood to greet me. No one smiled. I took my seat at the far end of the table and calmly placed the case on the polished surface. There were no pleasantries. My mother cleared her throat and launched into a monologue about the importance of moving forward. She spoke with practiced authority, eyes scanning the room, inviting nods of approval from those seated nearby. She used words like transition and innovation, terms so sterile they made the air colder. Then she handed out copies of the new development proposal, a full rebranding strategy, including franchise plans, product line cuts, and staff restructuring. At the bottom of the packet was a note, prepared in consultation with Davis and Rowe, effective immediately pending board affirmation. That was her real goal today. Not just to push me out. To secure approval. To make the betrayal permanent. I waited for her to finish. Then I reached into my case and pulled out my binders, placing them, one by one, in front of each attendee. Neatly labeled. Indexed. No drama. Just facts. My mother raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I began without raising my voice. I walked them through the timeline, methodically, unemotionally. I outlined the discrepancies in vendor payments. The inflated contracts. The invoice manipulation. The replacement of long-standing suppliers with friends of my mother, often at higher rates for lower quality. I referenced specific pages, dates, amounts. The room began to shift. People leaned forward. Brows furrowed. I handed out the printed statement from Samuel Yates, his professional analysis verifying what I had found. His language was clear: potential ethical violations, breach of fiduciary responsibility, and probable conflicts of interest. It carried weight. Still, my mother said nothing. So I played the voicemail. I connected my phone to the room speaker and tapped play. Grandpa's voice filled the space. Quieter than I remembered, but firm. Clear. The words about the white pine contract, the warning to me, his fear about decisions being made without his consent. His trust in my instincts. His love. Silence followed. No one moved. It wasn't just the content, it was hearing him again. Alive, if only for a moment. My mother's posture changed. Not dramatically, but her hands tightened around the edge of the table. A tell. The first crack in her carefully maintained exterior. I didn't stop there. I pulled out the clause from Grandpa's final business directives, the one allowing the operations director to challenge leadership changes made in bad faith within 12 months of his passing. I showed them the timestamp on the restructuring paperwork. The proof that I had still been operations director when those documents were signed. Then I submitted my petition for injunction, already reviewed and prepped by the estate attorney. A copy had been filed with the county business court just that morning. Now, the room moved. Greg leaned back in his chair, eyes wide. Marion looked down at her lap. Kayla's face twisted, not in shock, but in disbelief. She had never believed I would go this far. Never imagined I'd fight this hard. Finally, my mother spoke. Her voice was calm, but the edge was unmistakable. She said, "You don't understand how business works, Emily. Sometimes we have to make hard decisions. That doesn't make them wrong." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because the evidence spoke louder than any defense. The room began to buzz again, low murmurs between board members. Quiet questions. Legal terms whispered. The attorneys from Davis and Rowe leaned toward my mother, speaking quickly. Their faces no longer smug. One of the cousins on the board, Meredith, flipped through her binder with increasing speed. I saw her pause on the highlighted financials, her expression tightening. The conversation shifted from polite rejection to damage control. And still, I sat quietly. Letting the weight of their choices settle. Letting them feel the consequence of trying to erase me. Kayla was the first to speak out. Not to defend me, but to protect herself. She asked if any of the funds in question were traceable to board stipends or discretionary bonuses. She wanted to make sure she wasn't implicated. Her tone was clipped, her panic carefully disguised. My mother turned toward her, and for the first time, the tension cracked between them. It was subtle. A pause. A missed cue. A realization that the fortress she'd built might not hold. Greg cleared his throat and asked if the board could have time to review the documents before proceeding with any vote. His voice lacked conviction. My mother's control was slipping. And I didn't have to lift a finger. I had shown them what she was willing to hide. I had revealed the truth, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in honor. Of the man who built everything we had. The meeting adjourned without a vote. They needed time. They needed lawyers. They needed to think. And I walked out of that room not as a fired employee, but as the only person in the family who had stood her ground with facts, with integrity, and with unwavering loyalty to the legacy that mattered. As I stepped outside, the gray clouds had started to break. Sunlight filtered weakly through the overcast sky. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was a beginning. And this time it was mine. The days following the family meeting were strangely quiet. There were no emails. No threats. No apologies. Just silence. I wasn't surprised. My mother had built her entire life around control, managing narratives, guiding perception. The last thing she would do now was respond directly. Not while her attorneys tried to assess the damage. Not while she scrambled to decide whether to deny, deflect, or discredit. But silence isn't neutral. Silence is strategy. I didn't wait. The next morning, I met with our estate attorney to finalize the formal petition. It had already been filed, but now we needed to back it with clear legal narrative, why the restructuring qualified as a breach, how my position as operations director had been terminated without process, and why the petition should trigger a full halt to current transitions until proper review. The attorney, a sharp, detail-oriented woman named Cheryl Witt, went through the documentation meticulously. She wasn't effusive, but she nodded several times while reading. At the end, she gave me a simple assessment. You have enough. It's solid. And it's ethical. That was the part that mattered most to me. This wasn't a power play. I wasn't trying to take over, or rewrite the will, or seek damages. I wasn't fighting for a bigger slice, I was fighting for balance. For fairness. For the version of Hayes and Hearth that Grandpa had built. The one that valued people over profit margins and honored sweat over status. While Cheryl worked on the court filing, I reached out to the company's HR department. Though my mother technically sat as acting CEO, the department was still governed by the corporate charter. And that charter gave me the right to submit an internal grievance if I believed wrongful termination had occurred. I submitted a detailed, carefully written complaint, not just for myself, but to place an official record of everything that had happened. I included copies of my dismissal letter, the termination timeline, and the evidence surrounding my mother's misuse of her role. I knew it likely wouldn't reverse anything on its own, but it was another brick in the wall of accountability. I also contacted a few of the longtime employees, people who had known Grandpa well and who had expressed concern over the new changes. I didn't pressure them. I simply let them know what I was doing and why. Some asked if they could help. One offered to write a statement. Another forwarded me old emails where my mother had overruled staff decisions to push through inflated contracts. Word spread quickly. A quiet ripple of solidarity began to grow. Meanwhile, the board requested an emergency review. 3 members had called for it, not just family, but independent advisors who had joined in the last few years to bring in outside expertise. They weren't swayed by loyalty or legacy. They were focused on sustainability, risk, and ethics. And when the documents I had submitted landed in their hands, they acted swiftly. A formal vote was scheduled within 10 business days. The purpose: determine whether Linda Hayes had acted outside her authority, and whether she should be temporarily suspended pending full audit and review. That was the turning point. Because for the first time, she couldn't bury it. She couldn't silence it with money or charm or polished statements. This wasn't a personal spat. It was a legal issue. A corporate violation. And it was being treated as such. By the following week, I received notice that my termination had been placed under review. That meant I was technically reinstated, at least on paper, until the board could complete its assessment. I wasn't allowed back into the building, but my emails were restored, and a neutral interim administrator was brought in to oversee operations. The tide had shifted. But it wasn't about winning. It was about restoring integrity. That weekend, I visited the flagship store for the first time since the confrontation. I didn't go inside. I just stood across the street, watching. The sign above the door still bore Grandpa's name. The windows were clean. The staff inside moved with rhythm and care. A little girl in a red coat held her father's hand as they exited, clutching a small white box tied with ribbon. That was what I was fighting for. Not just the name. Not just the business. But the moments. The legacy. The values. Later that day, I received a call I didn't expect. It was Kayla. Her voice was careful, quiet. She didn't apologize, exactly, but she asked if we could meet. She said she didn't know the full extent of what Mom had done. That maybe she had let herself believe what was easiest. That she hadn't wanted to look deeper because looking deeper meant facing hard truths. We met the next evening at a small coffee shop near the lake. We didn't argue. We didn't rehash every hurt. She asked questions. I answered honestly. She said she was struggling to reconcile everything. That she'd built a version of our mother in her head that didn't match the one on paper. I told her I understood. Because I had done the same thing for years. And then she did something unexpected. She offered to speak to the board. Not to defend me, but to validate the facts. To acknowledge the financial choices. The backdoor deals. The silencing. It didn't erase the pain. But it mattered. It reminded me that people can change. That hearts can soften. That sometimes, even fractured relationships can find their way back. The board vote came 2 days later. My mother was formally suspended pending investigation. A full audit was ordered. An external committee was brought in. The development proposal she had rushed through was frozen. All contracts signed under her authority in the past 6 months were placed under review. And the board appointed a temporary leadership team to oversee operations. They asked if I would consider returning, not in my old role, but as interim legacy advisor. A position created to guide the company through its audit and realignment phase. I accepted. Not because I wanted the title, but because it allowed me to protect the values that had been abandoned. To guide the company back to its roots without punishing the people who still worked inside it. The bakers. The drivers. The cashiers. The people who hadn't taken sides, but had simply shown up every day and done their work with pride. My first act wasn't about policy or structure. It was about people. I reinstated the old employee bonus program Grandpa had created, small seasonal payouts for longtime staff based on service, not profit margins. I sent personal notes to each store manager, thanking them for holding the line during a turbulent season. And I met with the vendors who had been pushed out unfairly. Some returned. Some didn't. But they all appreciated the honesty. Little by little, the company began to breathe again. And for the first time in months, so did I. The winter passed slowly, like breath on glass, delicate, uncertain. The audit took weeks. Long, dry weeks of interviews, balance sheets, internal memos, vendor contracts, and meeting transcripts. It was exhausting, not because I had anything to hide, but because reliving it all, piece by piece, meant reopening every wound while maintaining composure. I didn't attend the board sessions. That wasn't my role anymore. But I was called upon often, to clarify, to verify, to provide context. Each time, I approached it like Grandpa would have, with professionalism, with clarity, without gloating. The findings, when they came, were as expected. Not criminal. But damning. Financial irregularities. Misuse of discretionary funds. Conflict of interest in vendor selection. Willful circumvention of internal protocols. Enough to warrant permanent removal from executive duties. Enough to close certain doors for my mother, both professionally and personally. The board issued its final decision quietly, in a 2-page letter. They thanked her for her years of service. A polite way of saying, your influence ends here. My mother didn't reach out. She didn't protest publicly. She withdrew, the way people do when they've built their lives on perception and the image cracks beyond repair. And yet, I didn't celebrate. Because even when justice is done, grief often lingers in the quiet spaces. It wasn't about winning. I hadn't wanted a war. I just wanted to be heard. To be trusted. To be seen. In the aftermath, I chose not to reclaim my old position. The operations director role was eventually filled by someone new, an internal candidate I'd trained years ago. Smart, kind, consistent. The kind of person Grandpa would have smiled at and said, "You've got good instincts." I stayed on for 3 more months as interim legacy advisor. I worked behind the scenes, helping restore systems that had been fractured. I sat with employees who needed reassurance. I attended one final board meeting, where I recommended a permanent legacy oversight committee, a small team whose job would be to keep the company grounded in its founding values, regardless of leadership transitions. It passed unanimously. After that, I quietly stepped away. I didn't need a corner office to carry the legacy forward. I carried it every day, in how I treated people, how I made decisions, how I honored the work that built everything. I started something new. Something small. A consulting practice for family-owned businesses in transition, those caught between generations, struggling with legacy, identity, succession. The kinds of families that had good intentions but complicated dynamics. I named it Ledger and Light, after Grandpa's two favorite words, one for accountability, one for vision. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't loud. But it was mine. And it mattered. Some clients came from old contacts. Others found me through referrals. A few came because they had read about the Hayes and Hart transition in industry journals and wanted help preventing their own family conflicts. And somewhere in the middle of all that rebuilding, professional and personal, Kayla and I started to find our rhythm again. Not perfectly. Not quickly. But honestly. We had lunch once a week. Sometimes we talked about work. Other times, just about life. She asked questions about the audit that she hadn't had the courage to ask before. I answered them without bitterness. She was trying. And that mattered. She brought up therapy once, how she and her partner had started sessions after everything settled. I could see the shift in her eyes. The weight of performance lifting, replaced by a cautious kind of authenticity. We didn't speak much about our mother. Sometimes you don't need to. Sometimes the silence says enough. One evening, after a long day consulting a family bakery in Vermont, I walked past a local Hayes and Hearth on my way home. The storefront glowed warmly in the fading light. Inside, the new manager I'd helped promote was laughing with a customer. The shelves were neatly stocked. A little boy was licking frosting off a cookie. It hit me, then, not in a wave, but like a gentle pull. I'd done what I came to do. I hadn't saved the company. That was never the point. I'd protected its soul. And maybe, just maybe, helped others find theirs too. People often think legacy is something you leave behind. But I've come to believe legacy is something you live. Every day. In choices. In boundaries. In the courage to speak when it's easier to stay silent. Grandpa used to say that integrity isn't just about what you do when no one's watching, it's about who you are when everyone is, and you do the right thing anyway. I think about that often now. Because doing the right thing didn't make me rich. It didn't repair everything. But it gave me peace. And peace, I've learned, is the kind of wealth no one can steal. So if you're watching this right now, and you're feeling like the black sheep, the overlooked sibling, the family scapegoat, I want to tell you something. You are not weak for setting boundaries. You are not selfish for protecting your values. You are not wrong for demanding respect. And you are definitely not alone. If this story resonates with you, if you've had to make hard choices to protect yourself or your integrity, drop a comment and tell me about it. I want to hear your story. And if you've ever been made to feel invisible, I see you. You're not. You matter. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want more stories about real people navigating complicated family legacies with courage, compassion, and truth. Until next time, honor your legacy. And never let anyone rewrite your worth.